The frozen steak hit my cheek with a sound I'll never forget, like a slap, but colder, harder, more final. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stood there in the kitchen doorway, my hand instinctively rising to touch the spot where the ice-cold meat had struck, feeling the immediate sting that would bloom into a bruise by morning. "Dinner's ready," I had said, just those 2 words. Spoken softly, the way I'd called my students to attention for 30 years, the way I'd summoned my own children to meals when they were small, and still thought I mattered. My son David didn't even look up from his phone. "I told you I wasn't hungry, but I made your favorite." That's when he threw it. The steak I'd taken from the freezer that morning, planning to thaw it slowly, cook it the way he liked with garlic and rosemary. It sailed through the air with surprising accuracy, finding my face with the precision of someone who'd aimed to hurt. The silence that followed was deafening. Even his girlfriend Melissa, curled up on the couch behind him, had stopped scrolling through whatever mindless content usually occupied her attention. For one brief moment, I thought she might say something, might acknowledge that what had just happened crossed a line no decent person should cross. Instead, she looked away. "You better not tell anyone," David said, his voice flat, emotionless. He was 32 years old, successful, respected in his field of software development. To his colleagues, he was David Morrison, the brilliant programmer who'd revolutionized their company's client interface. To his neighbors, he was the helpful guy who shoveled elderly Mrs. Patterson's driveway without being asked. To me, he had become a stranger wearing my son's face. I bent down to pick up the steak, its wrapper torn from impact, the meat already beginning to thaw against the warm kitchen tiles. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper, more fundamental, the tremor of a woman who'd just discovered she could disappear in plain sight, even to the person she'd carried in her body for 9 months and loved unconditionally for 32 years. "Elena," his voice held a warning now. "Did you hear me?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The steak felt heavier than it should have as I carried it to the sink, rinsing off the floor debris with water that seemed too loud in the sudden quiet of the house. Behind me, I heard his phone conversation resume. Melissa's artificial laugh at something on her screen, the normal sounds of a Tuesday evening in a home where I was learning I no longer belonged. When I touched my cheek again, it was already beginning to swell. 3 months ago, when I'd first suggested moving in with David after my divorce from his father, he'd seemed genuinely enthusiastic. "It makes perfect sense, Mom," he'd said over coffee at the little cafe near his office. "You shouldn't be rattling around in that big house all alone. And honestly, Melissa and I could use help with the bills." I'd sold my house, the one I'd loved, with its garden and reading nook and 30 years of memories embedded in every wall. I'd donated most of my furniture to charity, keeping only what would fit in David's spare room. I'd told myself this was a new chapter, a chance to be useful again, to matter in someone's daily life. The first week had been pleasant enough. I cooked meals they actually ate, helped with household tasks, made myself small and unobtrusive. Melissa had even complimented my homemade bread, though she immediately followed it with a comment about gluten being inflammatory. By the 2nd month, the compliments had stopped. By the 3rd, I'd become background noise, someone who cleaned up after them, bought groceries with money from my retirement account, and occasionally received irritated sighs when my presence inconvenienced their routines. Now, standing in the kitchen with a bruise forming on my cheek and tears I refused to let fall burning behind my eyes, I realized I'd traded my independence for invisibility. I'd given up my home to become a ghost haunting someone else's life. The frozen steak sat in the sink like evidence of a crime no one would ever prosecute. If you like emotional stories, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching? Because tonight, wherever you are, I want you to know that you're not alone if you've ever felt invisible in places where you should matter most. I wrapped ice cubes in a dish towel and held them against my cheek, watching through the kitchen window as the neighbor's porch light came on, casting long shadows across a yard where other families lived normal lives. Lives where grown children didn't throw frozen meat at their mothers, where love didn't feel like an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than treasured. The ice was melting through the towel, cold water dripping onto my collar, but I didn't move. I stood there in the fluorescent kitchen light, a 55-year-old woman discovering that some wounds never show up on x-rays, learning that the heart can bruise just as surely as flesh. Tomorrow, I would cover the mark with makeup before going to the grocery store. I would smile at the cashier and ask about her day. I would maintain the careful pretense that my life was exactly what it appeared to be from the outside. But tonight, in this kitchen that smelled like the dinner no one had wanted, I began to understand that silence could be its own kind of violence, and that sometimes, the people who promise to love you forever are the first ones to forget your name. The steak finally thawed completely, blood-red water swirling down the drain like something vital being washed away. The makeup covered the bruise well enough, but it couldn't hide the way I'd started walking differently in my own son's house. Quieter, smaller, always listening for signs of his mood before entering a room. 3 days had passed since the steak incident, and David acted as if nothing had happened. Worse than anger or apology, he'd chosen complete erasure of the moment. "Could you pick up my dry cleaning today?" he asked that Friday morning, not looking up from his laptop as he ate the scrambled eggs I'd made. "The ticket's on the counter." I nodded, though he wasn't watching. Melissa emerged from their bedroom in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, yawning dramatically as she opened the refrigerator. "Ugh, we're out of that almond milk I like," she announced to no one in particular. "I'll add it to the list," I said. "The organic one, though, not the regular stuff. It has to be the vanilla-flavored organic one from Whole Foods." She spoke to the refrigerator door, not to me. "And those protein bars I mentioned, the ones that actually taste good." "Of course." David closed his laptop with more force than necessary. "Mom, when you're out, could you swing by the post office? I need these contracts mailed today." He handed me a stack of envelopes without meeting my eyes. "Certified mail. Don't forget the tracking." "I won't forget. And maybe grab dinner for tonight? Something easy. Melissa and I have a conference call with Tokyo at 7. Something easy." I thought about the homemade lasagna I'd planned, the one that took 4 hours of careful layering and simmering. The recipe his grandmother had taught me when David was just a baby, back when family meals felt sacred instead of burdensome. "Sure," I said. "Anything specific?" "Just whatever," Melissa said, finally turning around. Her eyes skimmed over my face without really seeing me. "The way you might glance at furniture you've grown tired of. Nothing too heavy. We're trying to eat clean this month." After they left for work, I sat in the living room with my coffee, surrounded by the careful arrangement of their life together. Everything was coordinated. Throw pillows that matched curtains, books arranged by color rather than content, surfaces clean of any evidence that actual humans lived here. There were no photos of me, I realized. Plenty of David and Melissa at various events, vacations, celebrations, but in this curated display of their happiness, I'd been edited out entirely. The errands took most of the day. Dry cleaning, post office, grocery store, pharmacy to pick up David's prescription. Each stop required waiting, standing in lines behind other people who seemed to have purpose, destinations, people expecting their return. At the grocery store, I found myself lingering in the frozen food section, staring at packages of meat and remembering the sound that steak had made against my cheek. "Elena? Elena Rodriguez?" I turned to find Margaret Walsh, my former colleague from Jefferson Elementary. We'd taught 4th grade together for 15 years before I'd transferred to the high school. Her cart was filled with the chaotic abundance of someone feeding a large family. Boxes of cereal, bags of apples, enough pasta for a small army. "Margaret, how wonderful to see you." The smile came naturally, muscle memory from decades of classroom warmth. "I heard about you and Robert," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm sorry things didn't work out." "Thank you. It was for the best, really." The words sounded hollow even to me. "Are you doing okay? You look—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Tired." I touched my cheek instinctively, checking that the makeup was still in place. Just adjusting to some changes. I moved in with David while I figure out what's next. "That's nice. Family support is so important during transitions." Margaret's smile was genuine, but I could see the questions in her eyes. "We should have coffee sometime. I'd love to catch up properly." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it more than I'd expected to. "I'll call you. Do you still have the same number?" The question caught me off guard. I'd given up my landline when I sold the house, and David had insisted I didn't need my own internet service since I could use theirs. My entire contact with the outside world had narrowed to a cell phone and whatever digital access my son deemed appropriate. "Actually, let me get yours," I said, pulling out my phone. "I might be changing mine soon." We exchanged numbers, and Margaret squeezed my arm before pushing her cart toward the checkout. Don't be a stranger, Elena. Life's too short to lose touch with good friends. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that I might still exist outside the narrow confines of David's approval, that somewhere in this city were people who remembered when I had opinions, stories, a life that mattered beyond my utility as an unpaid housekeeper. When I arrived home with dinner, overpriced prepared food from the grocery store's deli section, David was already on his conference call. Through the closed office door, I could hear him speaking with the confident authority I remembered from his childhood, when he'd explained complex video games or scientific concepts with patient enthusiasm. He'd been such a curious boy, always asking why and how and what if. When had that brilliant child become this stranger who threw meat at his mother's face? Melissa sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone while picking at a salad she'd apparently made for herself. She looked up when I entered, her gaze moving to the bags of food with mild interest. What did you get? Rotisserie chicken, roasted vegetables, some rolls, I said, unpacking containers. I thought we could. Oh, I already ate. She gestured to her half-finished salad. I'm not really in the mood for heavy food tonight. I stared at the chicken, still warm from the store's heating lamps, the vegetables I'd carefully selected because I knew David liked carrots and Brussels sprouts. $30 of food for a family dinner no one wanted. Maybe David will be hungry when he finishes his call. Maybe, Melissa said, but her tone suggested otherwise. She returned to her phone, typing rapidly. I could see she was texting someone, her face lit up with amusement at whatever conversation was unfolding on her screen. I put the food in the refrigerator and made myself a small plate, eating standing up at the counter, while Melissa continued her digital social life 3 feet away from me. The chicken was dry, the vegetables over-seasoned. Everything tasted like the effort I'd wasted, the care that had nowhere to land. David's mom, I heard Melissa say into her phone, and realized she'd moved into the living room. Her voice carried that particular tone people use when explaining something mildly inconvenient. Yeah, she's staying with us for a while. I know. It's complicated. She laughed at whatever response she received, and the sound felt like another small wound. I was the complication in my son's life. The inconvenience to be managed and explained away to friends who probably couldn't imagine living with their own mothers-in-law. When David finally emerged from his office an hour later, he looked surprised to see me cleaning the kitchen. Oh, you got dinner. Thanks. He opened the refrigerator and examined the containers without enthusiasm. Actually, I grabbed something earlier. Big lunch meeting ran long. Of course he had. That's okay, I said, wiping down counters that were already clean. It'll keep. He nodded absently, already reaching for his phone. Hey, tomorrow's Saturday. Melissa and I are going to that new farmer's market downtown, then probably hitting some galleries. You don't mind holding down the fort, do you? Holding down the fort, as if I were a hired caretaker rather than his mother. As if my Saturday plans, which didn't exist, were automatically less important than their leisurely couple's activities. Of course not, I said. Great. Oh, and Mom? He paused in the doorway, finally making eye contact. For a moment, I thought he might acknowledge the distance growing between us, might say something that bridged the gap I could feel widening every day. Instead, he said, "The garbage disposal's been making that noise again. Think you could call someone to look at it?" After he left the kitchen, I stood there surrounded by the detritus of another invisible day. The dishes from meals no one had wanted, the bags from errands that served everyone but me, the careful arrangements I made that went unnoticed and unappreciated. In the growing darkness outside the kitchen window, I could see Mrs. Patterson next door settling into her evening routine, moving from room to room, turning on lights against the night. She lived alone, had for years since her husband passed, but even from a distance, her house felt more alive than this one, where 3 people shared space without sharing anything that mattered. I thought about Margaret's invitation for coffee, about the warmth in her voice when she'd recognized me in the grocery store, about the life I'd had before I'd convinced myself that family obligation was the same thing as love. The garbage disposal made its concerning noise again, metal grinding against something that didn't belong there. Tomorrow, I would call a repairman. I would wait for him to arrive, explain the problem, pay for the service with money from my dwindling savings account. David and Melissa would return from their farmer's market adventure to find it working perfectly. and they would accept this small miracle as just another example of problems that somehow solved themselves when I was around. But tonight, I let it grind and complain, a broken mechanical voice expressing all the things I couldn't say myself. The birthday card sat on my nightstand for 3 days before I found the courage to give it to David. I'd bought it the week before at the small pharmacy downtown, spending 20 minutes reading different messages until I found one that struck the right balance. Loving but not overwhelming, personal but not demanding. Inside, I'd written a simple note. 33 years ago, you made me a mother. Thank you for that gift. Love always, Mom. I'd also tucked in a check for $500, money I could barely afford from my teacher's pension. But David had mentioned wanting to upgrade his camera equipment for his photography hobby. Once upon a time, he'd shown me every picture he took, explaining lighting and composition with the same passion he'd brought to explaining his favorite books or movies. I thought maybe this small gesture might spark that connection again. Happy birthday, I said, finding him in the kitchen Saturday morning. Melissa was still asleep. She never emerged before 10 on weekends, and I'd hoped to have a quiet moment with just my son. David looked up from his phone, seeming genuinely surprised. Oh, thanks. He took the card with the distracted air of someone accepting junk mail, already turning back to whatever was capturing his attention on the screen. Aren't you going to open it? He glanced at me, then at the envelope, as if weighing whether this interruption was worth his time. Finally, he tore it open, his eyes scanning the message quickly. When he saw the check, his expression shifted, not to gratitude, but to something that looked almost like irritation. Mom, you don't need to do this. I wanted to. For your camera. I already bought the camera. Last month. He folded the check and set it on the counter. Besides, you shouldn't be spending money you don't have. The casual dismissal stung more than anger would have. He wasn't even touched by the gesture, just mildly annoyed by what he saw as my financial irresponsibility. The card lay open beside his coffee cup, my carefully chosen words now seeming desperate and foolish. Well, maybe you could put it towards something else you need. Mom. His voice carried a warning I'd learned to recognize. I said I don't need it. Melissa chose that moment to shuffle into the kitchen, wearing one of David's oversized t-shirts and looking effortlessly beautiful even with bedhead and no makeup. She mumbled something that might have been morning and headed straight for the coffee maker. It's David's birthday, I said, trying to inject some celebration into the moment. Melissa's response was directed toward the coffee rather than me. Are we still doing dinner at your mom's tonight? Yeah, 7:30, David said, his attention already back on his phone. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You're having birthday dinner with Melissa's family? It's been planned for weeks, he said without looking up. I could make your favorite cake, I offered. The chocolate one with the raspberry filling? We could celebrate when you get home. We'll probably be late, and honestly, I'm trying to cut back on sugar. Since when? David had always had a sweet tooth, used to beg me to make that exact cake every year since he turned 16. I'd perfected the recipe over the years, adding touches like the homemade raspberry preserve and the dark chocolate ganache that took hours to prepare properly. Maybe tomorrow then. Sunday dinner with cake for dessert. We've got plans tomorrow too, Melissa said, finally turning around. David's friend Jake is having people over for the game. I wasn't invited to that either, clearly. I stood there holding my coffee mug, watching my son's birthday plans unfold around me like I was observing someone else's life. 3 months ago, I would have been the one planning his celebration, gathering his favorite people, making sure every detail reflected how much he meant to me. Now I was an afterthought, if I was a thought at all. Later that morning, I decided to clean David's office while he was out running errands. He'd mentioned the space feeling cluttered, and I thought organizing his papers and dusting his equipment might be a helpful surprise. I worked carefully, respectfully, only moving things enough to clean properly. I was wiping down his desk when I noticed the bank statements scattered across one corner. I shouldn't have looked. Privacy was sacred, but my own name caught my eye on one of the documents. It was a savings account statement, and there, listed among the deposits, was my rent payment from last month. But instead of showing as a shared household contribution, it was labeled as Loan Repayment, E. Rodriguez. Loan repayment? I stared at the paper, trying to understand. I wasn't repaying a loan. I was contributing to our shared living expenses, just as we'd discussed. But according to this statement, David was treating my financial contribution as debt service. rather than family partnership. What are you doing? I spun around to find David standing in the doorway, his face dark with anger. I'd been so focused on the statement that I hadn't heard him come home. I was just cleaning. I told you not to touch my office. His voice was cold, controlled. Those are private documents. I'm sorry, I was only dusting. Were you reading my bank statements? The accusation hung between us like a physical barrier. In his eyes, I saw something that made my stomach clench. He was looking at me like I was a stranger. Worse, like I was someone untrustworthy, someone whose motives needed to be questioned. It was an accident. I saw my name. Your name? The rent money I give you. It says, loan repayment. I couldn't keep the hurt out of my voice. I didn't know that's how you saw it. David's jaw tightened. That's just how my accountant categorizes it, for tax purposes. But even as he said it, I could tell he was lying. The flush in his cheeks, the way he couldn't maintain eye contact, these were tells I'd learned to read when he was a boy trying to explain away broken windows or missing homework. I see, I said quietly. Just don't touch my things, okay? I have a system. I nodded and gathered the cleaning supplies, my hands shaking slightly as I folded the dust cloth. As I moved toward the door, David stepped aside just enough to let me pass, but not enough to be welcoming. I was being expelled from his private space, marked as someone who couldn't be trusted with the details of his life. That evening, while David and Melissa were at her parents' house celebrating his birthday, I sat alone in the living room with a piece of store-bought cake and a single candle. I'd bought it on impulse at the grocery store, a small round chocolate cake that looked nothing like the elaborate creations I used to make. I lit the candle and made a wish, not for David to love me again, but for the strength to understand what was happening to us. The candle burned down while I sat in the growing darkness, unwilling to turn on lights that might signal to the neighbors that someone was home alone on a Saturday night. Through the walls, I could hear Mrs. Patterson's television, the comforting drone of voices from whatever classic movie she was watching. She lived alone by choice, had told me once that solitude was preferable to bad company. At the time, I'd thought that sounded terribly sad. Now I was beginning to understand what she meant. When David and Melissa returned after midnight, they were laughing about something that had happened at dinner, their voices carrying the easy intimacy of people who belong together. They didn't notice me sitting in the dark living room, didn't ask about my evening, or thank me for the birthday card that was probably still lying forgotten on the kitchen counter. I waited until their bedroom door closed, then quietly gathered the remains of my solitary celebration. The paper plate with its crumbs, the burned-down candle, the plastic fork that had seemed absurdly optimistic when I'd unwrapped it. In the kitchen garbage, I found my birthday card, torn in half and buried under coffee grounds and takeout containers. The check was gone, probably cashed, despite David's protests about not needing it. I stood there holding the two pieces of the card, trying to fit them back together, but the tear had gone right through my handwritten message. The words, "Love always, Mom," were split down the middle, separated by a jagged line that seemed to represent everything that had broken between us. Outside, a car drove by with music playing softly, its headlights sweeping across the kitchen window before disappearing into the night. Somewhere, other families were ending their Saturday evenings with hugs and good nights, and the comfortable rituals of people who looked forward to seeing each other again tomorrow. Here, in my son's house, I was learning that love could exist in only one direction, that care could be given without being valued, and that the deepest wounds were often inflicted by the people who promised never to hurt you. I threw the torn card away and turned off the light, leaving the kitchen in darkness that felt less lonely than the bright spaces where I was supposed to belong. The phone calls from Margaret stopped being returned after the third week, not out of rudeness, but out of shame. How do you explain to a former colleague that you've become a ghost in your own life? That conversations about coffee dates and book clubs feel like invitations to a world you're no longer sure you deserve to inhabit? Elena, it's Margaret again, her voicemail said. I know you're probably busy, but I was thinking about that coffee. There's a new place downtown that does amazing scones. Call me when you get a chance. I saved the message instead of deleting it, the way you might keep a photo of a place you used to live. Evidence that somewhere, someone still thought of me as a person worth spending time with, rather than a problem to be managed. The days had begun to blur together in a rhythm of careful invisibility. I woke early, before David and Melissa, and had my coffee in the pre-dawn quiet when the house still felt neutral. before their presence transformed it back into a space where I was merely tolerated. I'd learned to shower quickly, use minimal hot water, leave no trace of my morning routine that might inconvenience them later. By the time they emerged, I'd usually retreated to my room with a book or my laptop, emerging only when necessary, to restock groceries they'd consumed, to handle repairs they'd mentioned in passing, to clean spaces they'd occupied and abandoned. "Mom, did you pay the electric bill?" David asked one Tuesday morning, not looking up from his breakfast. "Yes, it went through yesterday. And the internet? Paid on the first, like always." He nodded absently, already moving on to whatever occupied his mind: work deadlines, social plans, anything but the logistics of the life I was quietly maintaining around him. I'd become the invisible infrastructure of his comfort, the behind-the-scenes operations that kept everything running smoothly enough for him to forget they existed. Melissa had stopped acknowledging me entirely. Not out of malice, I don't think, but out of the particular blindness that comes when someone becomes so much a part of the scenery that you stop seeing them as human. She'd walk through rooms where I sat reading, step around me in the kitchen while I cooked, discuss weekend plans and dinner preferences in my presence as if I were a piece of furniture that happened to have ears. "We should really redecorate this living room," she said to David one evening, standing 3 feet from where I sat with my book. "The whole vibe is so dated. Very suburban mom." David glanced around the room, at the modest furniture I'd contributed when I moved in, the few personal touches I'd been allowed to add. "Yeah, maybe. What did you have in mind?" "Something more modern, cleaner lines. We could get rid of some of this older stuff, make it feel more like us." The older stuff included the reading chair where my mother used to sit during visits, the small bookshelf that held novels I'd collected over 30 years of teaching, the ceramic bowl my students had given me as a retirement gift. But I said nothing, just turned another page and pretended their words weren't erasing me piece by piece. That night I stood in my room, the guest room really, since nothing about it reflected my personality or choices, and looked at the few possessions I'd been allowed to keep: a handful of books, some clothes, a jewelry box that had been my grandmother's. Such a small collection to represent 55 years of living, of accumulating memories and meaning, and the tangible evidence of a life fully lived. In the jewelry box, beneath the simple pieces I wore regularly, I found something I'd almost forgotten about: my mother's gold locket. She'd given it to me on my wedding day. Her mother had given it to her, and so on back through generations of women who'd understood something about keeping precious things safe, even when the world tried to strip them away. I opened it carefully. Inside were tiny photos: my mother on one side, my grandmother on the other, faces of women who'd survived their own disappointments and emerged with their dignity intact. Women who'd learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence, in the preservation of self when everything around you insists you don't matter. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. The dinner hour became my daily reminder of how completely I'd disappeared from their consideration. I'd taken to making simple meals: pasta with store-bought sauce, pre-made salads, anything that required minimal effort, since my attempts at elaborate cooking were consistently ignored or criticized. "This sauce has too much sodium," Melissa announced one evening, pushing her plate away after 2 bites. "I can make something else," I offered. "Don't bother. I'll just eat the salad." David didn't even comment anymore, just ate whatever I provided with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling rather than enjoying a meal. The dining table, once a place where families gathered to share their days, had become a pit stop in their busy lives. I began eating before they came home, standing at the kitchen counter with a book propped against the toaster, finishing my small portions while the house was still quiet. By the time they arrived, I could simply serve them and retreat, avoiding the weight of sitting at a table where conversation flowed around me without including me. One Thursday evening, Margaret called again. "Elena, I'm starting to worry about you," her voicemail said. "It's not like you to be so hard to reach. I know transitions can be difficult, but isolating yourself isn't the answer. Please call me back." I stared at the phone in my hand, wanting so desperately to call her back, to hear a friendly voice that remembered when I had opinions and stories worth sharing. But what would I say? How do you admit that you've allowed yourself to become a paying guest in your own son's life? That the woman she remembered, confident, purposeful, valued, had somehow been misplaced in the move from my old house to this new reality? Instead, I turned off the phone and sat in the growing darkness of my room, listening to the sounds of David and Melissa's evening routine through the walls. Their laughter at something on television, the domestic intimacy of shared space and shared purpose, the comfortable assumption that tomorrow would bring more of the same contentment. I used to have that certainty, the confidence that I belonged somewhere, that my presence added value rather than created burden. Now I moved through their house like a careful visitor, always conscious of overstaying my welcome in spaces that had once felt like home. The grocery shopping had become my only regular contact with the outside world, and even that felt increasingly surreal. I'd push my cart through familiar aisles, selecting items from a list dictated by other people's preferences, using money from my pension to fund a life in which I was essentially a paying servant. "Paper or plastic?" the cashier would ask, and I'd realize these might be the only words spoken directly to me all day. "Paper, please. Have a nice day." "You too." Such simple exchanges, but they carried the weight of being seen, acknowledged as a person worthy of courtesy. In those brief moments, I existed again in the world's eyes, even if only as another customer in line, another transaction to complete. The drive home always felt longer than the drive there. At the store, I was Elena Rodriguez, retired teacher, woman with her own money and choices. But the moment I pulled into David's driveway, I transformed back into the problem to be managed, the expense to be justified, the presence to be tolerated. Late at night, when David and Melissa were asleep, I began taking walks around the neighborhood, not for exercise, but for the strange comfort of moving through spaces where no one expected anything from me, where my footsteps on sidewalks were just another anonymous sound in the suburban quiet. Other houses glowed with warm light, their windows offering glimpses of lives being lived with purpose and connection. I'd see families gathered around televisions, couples cleaning up after dinner, children doing homework at kitchen tables. Normal life, the kind I'd taken for granted until I found myself observing it from the outside like an anthropologist, studying a culture I could no longer claim membership in. Mrs. Patterson's house was always the last to go dark. Sometimes I'd see her silhouette moving past windows, and I wondered if she'd chosen her solitude or simply learned to make peace with it. There was dignity in her independence, something I'd lost when I'd traded my autonomy for the illusion of family connection. One night she was tending her garden when I walked by, pulling weeds in the light from her porch lamp. "Evening," she called softly. "Good evening, Mrs. Patterson. Lovely night for a walk." "Yes, it is." We didn't say more, but there was something comforting about the brief acknowledgement, the recognition that we were both women finding our own ways through the darkness. She returned to her weeding, and I continued my circuit, but for a moment, I'd felt less alone in my displacement. Back in David's house, I'd lie in the guest room bed and listen to the settling sounds of a home that wasn't mine, in a life that had no real place for me. The locket lay on my nightstand, its weight somehow reassuring in the darkness. Inside it, my mother and grandmother kept watch, witnesses to a lineage of women who'd survived worse than this, and found ways to reclaim their worth when the world forgot to value them. I was beginning to understand that survival sometimes meant stopping the pretense that things were other than they were, that love couldn't be earned through service when the recipient had already decided you weren't worth loving. That dignity required protecting something precious that others couldn't see or steal, even when they'd taken everything else. The library became my sanctuary. 3 blocks from David's house, it offered something I'd forgotten existed, a place where I could sit for hours without justifying my presence, where silence was expected rather than merely tolerated, where books waited with infinite patience for someone to discover them. I'd found myself gravitating toward the memoirs section, drawn to stories of women who'd navigated their own seasons of upheaval and emerged transformed. Maya Angelou, Joan Didion, Elizabeth Gilbert, voices that spoke to something I was only beginning to understand about resilience and reinvention. "You're here often," observed Janet, the librarian I'd spoken with several times about book recommendations. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair and laugh lines that suggested a life lived with humor intact, despite whatever challenges it had brought. "I suppose I am," I admitted, looking up from the memoir I'd been reading, a woman's account of rebuilding her life after her children left home and her marriage ended. "Nothing wrong with that. Libraries are for living in, not just visiting." Janet straightened some books on the nearby shelf, but her attention remained focused on me. "Are you new to the area?" "Recently relocated," I said. which was true enough without being the whole truth. It can be hard, starting over somewhere new, but you seem like someone who knows how to make the best of things. How did she see that in me? What quality was I projecting that suggested resilience when I felt so fragile, so uncertain about everything I'd once taken for granted about myself? That afternoon, I sat in the library's reading garden, a small outdoor space with benches arranged among flowering bushes and shade trees. Other people came and went, students with textbooks, elderly men reading newspapers, mothers with young children exploring picture books together. I watched them live their lives, pursue their interests, exist in the world with the confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. When had I stopped feeling that certainty about my place in the world? I thought about Elena Rodriguez at 25, newly graduated from Teachers College, walking into her first classroom with a canvas bag full of lesson plans and infinite optimism about shaping young minds. That woman had opinions about everything: literature, politics, the best way to help a struggling student discover their hidden talents. She laughed easily, spoke up in faculty meetings, hosted dinner parties where conversation flowed like wine, and everyone left feeling more connected to the world and each other. Elena, at 35, pregnant with David, reading parenting books and planning a nursery with the meticulous care of someone creating a masterpiece. She'd been so certain about the kind of mother she wanted to be, present but not hovering, supportive but not enabling, the steady presence that would help her child grow into a confident, compassionate adult. Elena, at 45, juggling teaching and motherhood and marriage with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to find joy in the beautiful chaos of a full life. Parent-teacher conferences, school plays, family vacations where everyone's different interests somehow wove together into shared memories. She'd been the organizing force that made it all work, the one who remembered birthdays and scheduled doctor appointments and ensured that love found practical expression in 1,000 small acts of care. That woman, those women, really, the different versions of myself I'd been across 3 decades, felt like characters from someone else's story now. Where had she gone? That confident person who'd known her own worth and expected others to recognize it too. I pulled out my phone and, for the first time in weeks, called Margaret back. "Elena, I was beginning to think you'd moved to another planet." Her voice was warm, slightly teasing, and hearing it made me realize how much I'd missed genuine human connection. "I'm sorry, Margaret. Things have been complicated." They usually are. But that's what Coffee with Friends is for, sorting through the complications. We made plans to meet the following Tuesday at the cafe she'd mentioned, and after I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope exactly, but possibility. The recognition that I still had choices, even if they weren't the ones I'd originally planned. That evening, instead of retreating to my room after dinner, I sat in the living room with a book. Not hiding, not trying to make myself invisible, just existing in the shared space like someone who belonged there. David and Melissa were watching television, some reality show about people competing for money by enduring various humiliations. "Could you turn the volume down a little?" I asked during a commercial break. "I'm trying to read." They both looked at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Melissa reached for the remote without comment, but I caught the glance she exchanged with David. Surprise mixed with something that might have been annoyance. "What are you reading?" David asked, and for a moment he sounded like the curious boy I remembered, the one who'd asked endless questions about everything. A memoir, about a woman who started over after her life fell apart. "Sounds depressing," Melissa said. "Actually, it's quite inspiring." She discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The conversation died there, but something had changed. I hadn't asked permission to exist in their space. I'd simply claimed my right to be there. And surprisingly, the world hadn't ended. Tuesday's coffee with Margaret felt like stepping back into a version of myself I'd thought was lost forever. We talked about books, former colleagues, the changes happening in education. Margaret told stories about her grandchildren's latest adventures, and I found myself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. "You look different," Margaret observed as we prepared to leave. "More like yourself, if that makes sense." "I think I'm remembering who that is." "Good. I was worried about you for a while there. You seemed diminished somehow." Diminished. The word stayed with me as I drove home. Yes, I had been diminished, but not by circumstances alone. I had participated in my own shrinking, convinced myself that taking up less space was a form of love rather than self-abandonment. The house felt different when I walked in, not changed physically, but my relationship to it had shifted. This was still David and Melissa's home, but I was no longer a supplicant begging for acceptance. I was a woman who had chosen to live here temporarily while I figured out what came next. That night, I took out the locket again, but instead of simply looking at the photos of my mother and grandmother, I put it on. The chain felt substantial against my skin, a tangible reminder of my lineage, of the strength that ran through generations of women who'd faced their own trials and emerged intact. I began to remember other things too. The scholarship fund I'd established at the school, still providing assistance to students who needed help pursuing their education. The letters from former students who still wrote occasionally, updating me on their careers and families, thanking me for believing in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. The garden I'd tended at my old house, where I'd coaxed beauty from difficult soil through patience and careful attention. The book club I'd organized for neighborhood women, where we'd discussed literature and life with equal passion. The volunteer work at the Literacy Center, where I'd helped adults learn to read and discovered that teaching was a calling that extended far beyond traditional classrooms. I was not just David's mother, though I would always love him. I was not just a woman whose marriage had ended, though that remained a source of grief. I was Elena Rodriguez, educator, gardener, reader, friend to many people who valued my presence in their lives. The realization didn't come as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual recognition, like watching sunrise slowly transform darkness into day. It wasn't that my circumstances had changed. I was still living in my son's house, still feeling the sting of his emotional distance, but something in my perspective had shifted fundamentally. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The pain had been my desperate attempts to win back love that was being withheld, to earn acceptance from people who'd already decided I was a burden. The clarity was understanding that their opinion of my worth wasn't the same thing as my actual worth, that their inability to see my value didn't diminish its existence. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, content in her solitary garden, and realized she hadn't been abandoned by life. She'd chosen dignity over compromise. I thought about the women whose stories I'd been reading, who'd discovered that the ending of one chapter didn't mean the ending of the book. That night, I started making a list. Not of grievances or demands, but of possibilities. Things I wanted to do, places I might like to live, ways I could contribute to the world that didn't depend on other people's approval or gratitude. The list was surprisingly long once I allowed myself to imagine without limitations. Teaching at the community college, traveling to places I'd only read about, volunteering with literacy programs, maybe even writing, not just the classroom newsletters and parent communications that had filled my professional life, but something more personal, more true. For the first time since moving into David's house, I fell asleep without replaying the day's small humiliations or planning tomorrow's careful invisibility. Instead, I dreamed about a different Elena, one who knew exactly who she was and had stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The locket warmed against my throat as I slept, and somewhere in my dreams, I heard my mother's voice reminding me of something she'd told me long ago. Mija, people can take many things from you, but they cannot take who you are unless you hand it to them yourself. I had been handing over pieces of myself for months, trying to purchase love with self-erasure. But some things were too precious to trade away, too essential to sacrifice for the comfort of others. It was time to stop the transaction. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, addressed to Elena Rodriguez in careful handwriting I didn't recognize. David had collected the mail as usual, sorting through bills and advertisements with the mechanical efficiency of someone managing household operations. He handed me the envelope without comment, his attention already moving to something more pressing on his phone. Elena Rodriguez, I read aloud, turning the envelope over to examine the return address. Sarah Martinez, Director, Golden Years Community Center. What is it? David asked absently. I'm not sure. Inside, the letter was typed on official letterhead, but the tone was warm and personal. Dear Elena, your name was given to me by Margaret Walsh, who mentioned you might be interested in educational opportunities within our community. We're launching a new program called Wisdom Circle, intergenerational learning sessions where experienced educators share their knowledge with younger community members. Margaret felt you would be an excellent fit as a program coordinator. If you're interested, I'd love to meet for coffee to discuss the details. The position comes with a modest stipend and the satisfaction of making a real difference in people's lives. Please call me at your earliest convenience. I read the letter twice, feeling something flutter in my chest that I hadn't experienced in months. Someone wanted my expertise, valued my background, saw me as a person with something valuable to offer the world. "What's it about?" David asked, glancing up from his phone. "A job opportunity, teaching position at the community center." For the first time in weeks, he looked directly at me with something approaching interest. "What kind of position?" "Coordinating educational programs for different age groups. Part-time?" "I assume so. It mentions a stipend." He nodded and returned to his screen. "That might be good for you. Give you something to do. Something to do." As if my life had become an empty container that needed filling with activities to prevent boredom. But even his casual dismissal couldn't diminish the excitement building inside me. Someone had remembered that Elena Rodriguez existed, had thought enough of my abilities to recommend me for meaningful work. I called Sarah Martinez that evening from the quiet of my room. "Elena, Margaret spoke so highly of you. She said you were one of the most dedicated educators she'd ever worked with, and that you had a gift for making complex subjects accessible to everyone." We talked for nearly an hour about the program's vision, the demographics they hoped to serve, the ways that experienced professionals could mentor younger people while learning from them in return. Sarah had a background in social work and had seen too many older adults struggle with isolation and purposelessness after retirement. The research shows that people thrive when they feel useful, when their knowledge and experience are valued by their community, she explained. "We're trying to create connections that benefit everyone involved." By the end of our conversation, we'd scheduled a formal interview for the following Tuesday. After I hung up, I sat on my bed feeling something I'd almost forgotten: anticipation. The sense that tomorrow might bring something better than today, that my story was still being written. The weekend brought unexpected tension. David and Melissa had planned to spend Saturday shopping for furniture to redecorate the living room, the project Melissa had mentioned weeks earlier. They returned with fabric samples, paint chips, and an enthusiasm for transformation that didn't include consulting me about my preferences or comfort. "We're thinking of going with a more minimalist aesthetic," Melissa announced, spreading color swatches across the coffee table. "Clean lines, neutral tones, less clutter." The clutter she referenced included my reading chair, the small bookshelf holding my favorite novels, and the ceramic bowl my students had given me, the few personal items I'd been allowed to integrate into their carefully curated space. "What did you have in mind for my things?" I asked. "Well, we thought maybe you could keep them in your room," David said without meeting my eyes. "Make the living room more cohesive." More cohesive. Another way of saying my presence disrupted their vision of domestic perfection. But instead of the familiar ache of rejection, I felt something cooler, more analytical. They were trying to erase me from the common areas of the house, to restrict my existence to the single room they'd grudgingly provided. 6 months ago, I would have agreed immediately, apologized for the inconvenience, helped them pack away my belongings to make space for their improved vision. But the woman who'd rediscovered her worth in the library, who'd been offered a position based on her expertise and experience, saw this request differently. "I understand you want to redecorate," I said carefully, "but I'd prefer to keep my reading chair in the living room. I use it every evening." The silence that followed felt charged with surprise. David and Melissa exchanged a look that suggested they'd expected automatic compliance. "It doesn't really fit with the new color scheme," Melissa said, her voice carrying a note of patience that felt patronizing. "Then perhaps we should choose a color scheme that accommodates the furniture that's already here." Another silence, longer this time. David's jaw tightened in a way I recognized, the expression he'd worn as a teenager when his authority was questioned or his plans thwarted. "Mom, we're trying to make some improvements to our home," he said, emphasizing the possessive pronoun. "It would be helpful if you could be flexible about this. Our home. Not the house where we all live, or our shared space, but their home where my presence was tolerated as long as it didn't interfere with their preferences." "I am being flexible," I replied. "I'm suggesting we find a solution that works for everyone." The conversation ended without resolution, but something fundamental had shifted. I hadn't backed down or apologized for existing. I'd stated my needs clearly and calmly, without aggression, but also without the desperate accommodation that had characterized my behavior for months. That night, David knocked on my door, the first time he'd initiated a private conversation since I'd moved in. "Can we talk?" I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his expression serious in a way that reminded me of difficult conversations from his childhood, discussions about grades, friends, choices that disappointed me. "About the furniture situation," he began. "I think you misunderstood what we were trying to do." "I don't think I misunderstood anything. We're just trying to make the house feel more like us. More adult. More adult." The implication hung between us like an accusation. My presence, my belongings, my very existence in their space somehow made their home feel less mature, less sophisticated. "I see," I said quietly. "It's not personal, Mom. It's just, we have a vision for how we want to live, and some compromises need to be made." "By me, you mean? The compromises need to be made by me." He shifted uncomfortably. "We're all making compromises. This living situation wasn't exactly part of our original plan either." The words hit like a physical blow, but cleaner than the frozen steak had months earlier. This was honest cruelty rather than impulsive violence. David acknowledging that my presence in his life was an unwelcome deviation from his preferred narrative. "I understand," I said, and realized I truly did. "Thank you for being direct about that. So you'll move your things?" "We'll see." I closed the door before he could respond, leaving him standing in the hallway with my non-commitment hanging in the air between us. Inside my room, I sat on the bed and felt the strangest sensation, not hurt, not anger, but a kind of crystalline awareness. David had just told me exactly where I stood in his priorities, had made it clear that his comfort mattered more than mine, that their vision for their future didn't include space for my needs or preferences. It was information, nothing more and nothing less. Painful information, but useful. I thought about the job interview scheduled for Tuesday, about Sarah Martinez's enthusiasm for the contributions I could make to her program. I thought about Margaret's friendship, offered freely without conditions or expectations of my usefulness to her personal agenda. Somewhere beyond this house where I was tolerated rather than welcomed, a world existed where Elena Rodriguez was valued for exactly who she was, where my experience mattered, my opinions carried weight, my presence added rather than subtracted from the whole. The realization didn't bring immediate relief. I still faced the practical realities of finding new housing, rebuilding financial independence, navigating the logistics of major life change. But it brought something more valuable than comfort: certainty. I knew what I needed to do. The only question was when and how to do it with dignity intact. Outside my window, Mrs. Patterson's house glowed with warm light, every room illuminated against the early evening darkness. She moved from kitchen to living room with purposeful efficiency, a woman comfortable in her own space, answerable to no one but herself. Her solitude no longer looked lonely to me, it looked like freedom. I picked up the letter from Sarah Martinez and read it again, focusing on the phrase that had caught my attention during our phone conversation: making a real difference in people's lives, not serving them, not accommodating their preferences, not disappearing to make their existence more convenient. Making a difference, being seen, valued, essential. The interview couldn't come soon enough. The interview with Sarah Martinez took place in a sunny corner office overlooking the community center's garden, where elderly volunteers tended raised beds alongside teenagers from the local high school. Through the window, I watched a white-haired woman patiently showing a young boy how to identify ripe tomatoes, both of them laughing when he chose one that was still determinedly green. "That's exactly what we're hoping to create more of," Sarah said, following my gaze. "Those connections that happen naturally when people of different generations work together toward something meaningful." The interview felt less like a job interrogation and more like a conversation between colleagues. Sarah asked about my teaching philosophy, my experience with diverse learning styles, my vision for intergenerational programming. For the first time in months, I found myself speaking with the confidence of someone whose expertise was valued, whose ideas were taken seriously. "Margaret wasn't exaggerating about your qualifications," Sarah said, reviewing the portfolio I'd assembled of lesson plans, student feedback, and curriculum innovations from my teaching years. "This is exactly the kind of creative, inclusive approach we need. I'd love to be part of what you're building here," I said, and meant it more than any professional statement I'd ever made. "The position is yours if you want it," Sarah replied without hesitation. 20 hours a week to start, room to grow as the program expands. We can begin whenever you're ready. Walking back to my car after accepting the position, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my divorce. Pride in my own accomplishments. Not pride in serving others well or meeting their expectations, but satisfaction in my professional competence, my ability to contribute meaningfully to work that mattered. I drove home through familiar neighborhoods that suddenly looked different, charged with possibility instead of trapped in routine. Trees that had seemed bare and lifeless just weeks earlier were showing the first hints of spring growth, small green promises that winter eventually ended, that dormant things could come back to life. David and Melissa were in the living room when I arrived, surrounded by furniture catalogs and paint samples, deep in planning mode for their redecoration project. They looked up when I entered, and I could see in their expressions the expectation that I would either slink quietly to my room or offer to help with their domestic vision. "How was your appointment?" David asked with the polite disinterest of someone making conversation while focused on more important matters. "Very well, actually. I got the job." "That's nice," Melissa said, returning her attention to a catalog spread across her lap. "What did you say it was again?" "Program Coordinator for Intergenerational Learning. I'll be developing curriculum that brings different age groups together for educational experiences." "Sounds like teaching," David observed, his tone suggesting this was somehow a step backward rather than forward. "It is teaching. That's what I do." Something in my voice made him look up, really look at me, for the first time in our conversation. Perhaps he heard the certainty there, the absence of the apologetic tone that had characterized my interactions with them for months. "When do you start?" "Next Monday. 20 hours a week to begin with. But Sarah mentioned the program is likely to expand." "Sarah?" "The director, Sarah Martinez. We talked about the possibility of developing adult literacy components, maybe evening programs for working parents." I was talking about my new job with the enthusiasm of someone who believed in what she was doing, someone who expected her work to be valued and respected. The Elena who spoke about her future plans was not the same woman who'd been tiptoeing through their house, apologizing for existing. "That's good, I guess," David said, though his expression suggested confusion rather than celebration. "Will you be able to keep up with things here? The house stuff, I mean?" "The house stuff." My unpaid labor maintaining their domestic comfort while they pursued their careers and social lives. The assumption that even with a new job, my primary responsibility remained making their lives easier. "We'll need to make some adjustments," I said carefully. "What kind of adjustments?" Melissa asked, finally giving me her full attention. "I'll be working Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, some Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I won't be available for errands and household tasks during those hours." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken implications. For months, I'd been their unpaid domestic support system, handling shopping, cleaning, cooking, and maintenance, while they focused on their careers and relationship. The idea that I might prioritize my own professional obligations over their convenience had apparently never occurred to them. "I suppose we can work around that," David said slowly. "Actually," I continued, feeling the momentum of my new certainty, "I've been thinking it might be time for me to find my own place. This arrangement was always supposed to be temporary while I got back on my feet." The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence. David's face went through several expressions: surprise, relief, something that might have been panic. "Your own place? Are you sure you can afford that? I mean, this job doesn't pay very much, does it? Enough to cover a modest apartment and basic expenses. I've been looking at some options." This was only partially true. I'd started browsing rental listings online, but hadn't yet visited any properties. Still, the research had shown me that my pension combined with the new salary could support a simple, independent life. "Mom, you don't need to rush into anything," David said. And for the first time in our conversation, I heard something approaching genuine concern in his voice. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to." Welcome. The word would have meant everything to me 6 months ago. Now it felt hollow, a courtesy offered when departure was already in motion, when the speaker had realized too late what they'd been taking for granted. "That's very kind," I said. "But I think it's time." "When?" Melissa asked. The question came out sharper than she'd probably intended, revealing more enthusiasm for my departure than social convention typically allowed. I'll start looking seriously this weekend, hopefully within the month. David's expression shifted again, settling into something I couldn't quite read. If that's what you want, it is. The conversation drifted into practical details: lease logistics, moving logistics, the division of shared household items I'd contributed. But underneath the mundane planning, something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between us. I was no longer a dependent asking for accommodation, but an adult making autonomous decisions about her own life. That evening, I called Margaret to share my news. "Elena, that's wonderful. I knew Sarah would love you, and your own place. How do you feel about that?" "Terrified and excited in equal measure," I admitted. "It's been so long since I've lived alone. You'll remember quickly. There's something profound about having space that's entirely yours, where every decision reflects your preferences rather than someone else's compromises." After we hung up, I sat in my room, soon to be David's guest room again, and tried to imagine what my own apartment might look like. Small, probably, but arranged exactly the way I wanted it. Books displayed prominently instead of hidden away, my reading chair positioned to catch the best light, meals planned around my preferences, prepared when I was hungry, eaten while reading or listening to music or sitting in comfortable silence. No one interrupting to complain about noise levels or cooking smells. No one questioning my choices or making me feel like an inconvenience. No one throwing frozen meat at my face when I offered care they didn't want. The thought should have been lonely, but instead, it felt like liberation. Around 10 o'clock, I heard voices from the living room, David and Melissa talking in the animated tones people use when they're excited about something. I couldn't make out words, but the energy was unmistakably positive, celebratory even. They were discussing my departure, I realized, planning how they would reconfigure the space once I was gone, imagining their life without the complication of my presence. The recognition stung, but cleanly, like pulling out a splinter that had been causing low-level pain for months. I opened the jewelry box and took out my mother's locket, fastening it around my neck with steady hands. Tomorrow, I would start apartment hunting in earnest. I would begin creating a life that belonged entirely to me, where my worth wasn't contingent on other people's approval or gratitude. The woman in the mirror looked different than she had 3 months ago. Thinner, perhaps, but stronger somehow. More present in her own eyes, more certain about what she deserved from the world. "You were right, Mama," I whispered to the locket warming against my skin. I stopped letting them take who I am. Outside my window, Mrs. Patterson's house glowed with its usual evening warmth. Tomorrow, I would knock on her door and ask if she knew of any good rental properties in the neighborhood. Tonight, I would fall asleep planning a future that finally felt like my own. The apartment was perfect in its imperfection. A one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, with hardwood floors that creaked in friendly places and windows that faced east toward morning light. The kitchen was small but efficiently designed, with enough counter space for one person who enjoyed cooking for herself. The living room could accommodate my reading chair, my bookshelf, and still leave room for a small table where I could grade papers or work on lesson plans. Previous tenant was a retired teacher too, mentioned Mrs. Chen, the landlord, as she showed me through the space. Lived here 12 years, took excellent care of everything. Only moved because her daughter insisted she relocate to Arizona for her arthritis. The bathroom had a deep clawfoot tub, perfect for long soaks with a book balanced on the rim. The bedroom window looked out onto a maple tree that was just beginning to show spring buds, promising shade in summer and beautiful colors come autumn. "I'll take it," I said, before Mrs. Chen finished showing me the closet space. "Don't you want to think about it? Discuss it with your family?" "No," I said, smiling at how good the word felt. "This is my decision, and I've made it." The lease signing took place the following Tuesday in Mrs. Chen's downstairs office, a cozy space that smelled of jasmine tea and contained more books than furniture. She served me green tea in delicate china cups while we handled the paperwork, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't experienced in months. "You seem very certain about this change," she observed, watching me sign the documents with steady hands. "I am. It's been a long time coming. Good for you." Too many people stay in situations that diminish them because they're afraid of the alternative. But independence is always better than dependence that costs you your dignity. Her words stayed with me as I drove back to David's house, back to the guest room that would be mine for only 2 more weeks. I'd given my notice the previous evening, stating my move-out date with the same calm certainty I'd brought to all our recent conversations. David's response had been a mixture of relief and something that might have been guilt. "Are you sure you've thought this through, Mom? Living alone at your age?" "My age?" I'd laughed, genuinely amused. "I'm 55, not 85, and I lived alone quite happily for 2 years after your father moved out. I can manage to prepare my own meals and remember to lock the door at night." Melissa had been less subtle in her enthusiasm. "Will you need help packing? We could probably borrow Jake's truck for your furniture." The eagerness to facilitate my departure would have wounded me 6 months ago. Now it simply confirmed what I'd already understood about my place in their lives. The moving process was surprisingly simple, mostly because I had so little to move. The reading chair, the bookshelf, my clothes and personal items, a few kitchen pieces I'd brought to David's house thinking we'd share cooking duties. Everything fit easily into a rental truck that took just one trip to transport from their space to mine. Margaret and her husband Tom helped with the heavy lifting, along with Mrs. Patterson, who'd insisted on contributing despite her 78 years. "Nonsense," she'd said when I'd protested her involvement. "I may be old, but I'm not fragile. Besides, I've been waiting years for a kindred spirit to move into this neighborhood." The 4 of us made quick work of the move, and Margaret insisted on bringing lunch for everyone. Sandwiches and soup that we ate sitting on boxes in my new living room, while natural light streamed through clean windows. "It feels like you," Margaret said, looking around the space. "Peaceful but purposeful." "It feels like home," I agreed, and realized I meant it completely. Mrs. Patterson stayed after the others left, helping me unpack books and arrange them on the shelves with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood the importance of making a space truly livable as quickly as possible. "You know," she said, sliding my copy of Jane Eyre into place next to other well-worn favorites, "I recognized something in you from the beginning. The look of a woman who'd temporarily lost herself, but wasn't gone permanently." "How could you tell?" "Experience. I had my own season of being invisible, back when my Harold was dying. His family made it very clear that I was an inconvenience to their grieving process, that my emotions were somehow inappropriate because I was just the wife, rather than a blood relative." She straightened a crooked book with gentle precision. "I learned that some people will take as much as you're willing to give, and they'll never appreciate the sacrifice because they can't see past their own needs." "How did you find your way back?" "Same way you did. Remembered that being alone with my dignity was better than being surrounded by people who didn't value what I offered." She smiled, her face creasing into lines that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Though I suspect your story isn't quite finished yet. My first week alone was a revelation. I woke when my body was ready, rather than when I needed to be quiet for other people's schedules. I made coffee exactly the way I liked it. Read the newspaper while eating breakfast instead of rushing through meals to clean up after others. I spent entire Saturday mornings in my pajamas, reading novels and listening to music that reflected my preferences rather than anyone else's. The community center job filled my days with purpose and connection. The Wisdom Circle program launched with 12 participants, 6 older adults with various professional backgrounds, 6 young people seeking mentorship and life guidance. I facilitated discussions between a retired engineer and a high school student interested in robotics, connected a former nurse with a young woman considering medical school, watched friendships form across generational lines that had seemed impossible to bridge. "You have a gift for this," Sarah observed after our 3rd week of sessions. "The participants trust you to create safe space for real conversation." "It's easier than I expected," I admitted. "When people feel heard and valued, they naturally want to share their best selves." 3 months into my new life, Margaret invited me to attend a women's support group that met monthly at the community center. "It's very informal," she explained. "Women of all ages, various backgrounds, sharing stories and supporting each other through life transitions." The group met in the same room where I facilitated Wisdom Circle, but the energy was different in the evening, more intimate somehow with the space lit by table lamps rather than overhead fluorescents. 12 women ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, sitting in a comfortable circle with cups of tea and the kind of relaxed attention that comes when people have permission to speak their truth. "We usually start with introductions," said Linda, a woman about my age who seemed to facilitate through gentle guidance rather than formal leadership. "Share whatever feels relevant about where you are in your life right now." When my turn came, I looked around the circle at faces that showed various forms of struggle and strength, and found myself telling the truth about the past year, about the divorce, the move to David's house, the months of feeling invisible and insignificant, about the frozen steak, and the gradual recognition that I'd been participating in my own disappearance. The hardest part, I said, surprised by my own honesty, was realizing that my son didn't value me the way I'd assumed he did, that my love for him wasn't reciprocated in any meaningful way. Several women nodded with the recognition of shared experience. But the most important part, I continued, was remembering that his opinion of my worth isn't the same thing as my actual worth, that I could choose dignity over desperation, independence over acceptance at any cost. After the meeting, a younger woman named Carmen approached me. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "I've been living with my sister's family since my husband left, and I've been making myself smaller and smaller, trying not to be a burden. But listening to you, maybe being a burden is better than disappearing completely." "You're not a burden," I told her. "You're a person in transition, and transitions take time. But don't lose yourself in the process of being grateful for other people's help." Driving home that night, I thought about how sharing my story had felt both vulnerable and empowering. The women in that circle had listened without judgment, had recognized the universal elements in my particular experience of finding myself again after a period of profound loss. In my apartment, I made chamomile tea and sat in my reading chair with the locket around my neck, feeling the presence of the women who'd come before me, who'd survived their own seasons of invisibility and emerged with their essential selves intact. The phone rang as I was preparing for bed. "Mom?" David's voice carried a hesitancy I hadn't heard since he was young, and calling to confess some childhood transgression. "Hello, David. I wanted to check how you're settling in. The apartment and everything." "Very well, thank you. It's a lovely space." A pause. "I've been thinking about how things were when you were staying with us. I don't think I was I could have been more." He trailed off, apparently unable to find words for what he wanted to say. In the silence, I could hear him struggling with something that might have been an apology, or at least an acknowledgement that our arrangement hadn't been fair to me. "David," I said gently, "we're both in a better place now. You have your space the way you want it, and I have mine. That's what needed to happen." "Yeah, but I feel like maybe we didn't appreciate what's done is done. What matters is what we do going forward." Another pause. "Maybe I could take you to dinner sometime. See your new place?" "I'd like that," I said, and realized I meant it, not because I was desperate for his approval or affection, but because I was curious about whether we could build a different kind of relationship, one between two independent adults, rather than one between a mother sacrificing herself for a son taking her for granted. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my own space, surrounded by my own choices, accountable to no one but myself for how I spent my evening. The silence felt full rather than empty, charged with possibility instead of weighted with disappointment. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. It was the silence of a woman who'd stopped explaining herself to people who weren't listening, stopped asking for love from people who'd already decided she wasn't worth it, stopped shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were too small for her spirit. In that silence, I'd found my voice again, and my voice, it turned out, had quite a lot to say.